Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of My Favorite Norn Scripts. Today I'm going to be talking about Andrew's latest release, Noodles. I had the pleasure of testing an early version of this script a number of months ago and instantly loved it. This beta release seems to have expanded on a lot of the features and it feels like it's in a really good place. There's a lot to go over here, so I'm going to dive right in. Noodles is made up of 3 pages: the mix page, the tape page, and the filter page. These pages can be flipped through using buttons on the grid. I'm going to go over the grid controls in depth a bit later on in the video, but just know that like cheat codes or MLR and MLRE, this script derives a lot of its utility from the grid. When you load the script, you'll be on the mix page. This might look a bit overwhelming, but like the other scripts that utilize multiple buffers, the controls are the same for each track. From this page, you can set the record feedback amount for each track, the output volume for each track, the stereo spread amount, randomize the level and spread, as well as see the record, loop, and play indicators, page indicator, buffer indicator, send and return toggles, and preset indicator. Starting from the top, we have the old amount. This is controlled with encoder 1 and sets the amount of signal preserved between loops. At 1, this will do sound on sound looping, and at 0, each pass of the record head will wipe the previously recorded material. You can see the old level for each track reflected in these little bars in the middle of the screen. By default, encoder 1 will set the old amount for all tracks. I'll talk about how to change that shortly. Encoder 2 sets the output level for the current track, and encoder 3 will offset the stereo placement of all the buffers. Button 2 will randomize the level of the current track, and button 3 will randomize the pan position of the current track. If you long press either button, it will set the value back to its default. I might be wrong, but it seems like the values won't be randomized if the parameter scope is set to global. This brings us to the final group of controls on this page, which can be accessed by holding button 1. This brings up the scope controls and preset initialization behavior. Scope allows you to set whether a control affects a single track, all tracks, or the current preset. You can scroll through the different options for each parameter with their respective knobs. Pressing button 2 will set the preset initialization behavior for level, and pressing button 3 will handle spread. D represents default initialization, and X represents random. One thing to note here is that if old scope is set to global, then all of the playback rate controls made in the future will be linked together. I want to quickly show the differences between the different scope modes because each of them have unique use cases. I'm going to record a single note into buffer 1. You need an active buffer for the presets to be accessible. You'll notice that numbers 1 through 7 have popped up at the bottom once I have something recorded. This indicates which preset you're currently using. By default, level is handled on a track-by-track basis. As I lower the volume, you'll see that only track 1's volume is lowering. If I change the scope to global, you'll see that as I lower the volume, all of the tracks will be lowered in unison. The last scope option is preset, and this is where things get interesting. I'm going to lower the volume for preset 1. Now if I switch to preset 2, you'll see that the level is back up to its default position. I can change the level here and now go to preset 3 where I can add a third level. For this example, I'm going to put it to 0. Now I can swap between the different presets and the level I set will be recalled. The old level and spread can be saved to presets as well. You just need to set both of their scopes to preset and dial the amounts in accordingly. The second page is the tape page. The layout of this page is similar to the first page, with all of the same icons in the same places. The main function of this page is for setting the playback window and length of your recordings, as well as setting the playback rate. Encoder 1 controls the rate. Unlike the rate controls on the grid, this rate control is non-quantized and ranges 1 octave either up or down. The rate changes applied here are after the rate changes from the grid. By default, the rate parameter is only affecting the current track, but just like on the mix page, holding button 1 will allow you to change the scope. The same goes for our next two controls, window and length. Window is controlled by encoder 2 and lets you set the start position for your loop, as well as shift the entire playback window around through the length of the buffer. Encoder 3 handles the length and sets the endpoint. Button 2 will randomize the window, and button 3 randomizes the length. Just like on the mix page, long pressing either button will set the value back to its default. The third and final page is the filter page. This gives you access to a few different filter types and their respective controls. Encoder 1 sets the filter resonance and by default is global. Encoder 2 sets the filter cutoff frequency ranging from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. Encoder 3 sets the filter type, either low pass, which is the default, bandpass, high pass, or bypass, which is off. Button 2 will randomize the cutoff, and button 3 will randomize the type. Like the other two pages, long pressing either button will return that parameter to its default position, and holding button 1 will allow you to change the scope of the parameter. Noodles has a fairly extensive parameters menu. The majority of the options here are represented on the grid, so if you're using a grid, most of these will be redundant. There are a few hidden things here though. First, in the track parameters section, there is a gain submenu. This allows you to boost or trim the individual tracks and is summed with the level value. In the documentation, Andrew says that this enables you to get an additional level of control over the individual track volumes if their scopes have been set to global or preset. The second group of additional controls are found in the softcut options section. Input routing allows you to set whether audio is being received from the left or right input. Noodle's input is mono, so this can be relevant if you're working with a sound source that has a wide stereo field. Alias disables or enables the anti-aliasing filter. Record transition sets the slew time for the record input levels. This is useful for smoothing out loop points. Before I move on to the grid, there are two additional points that I want to touch on. First is the randomization submenu in the metaparam options section. This allows you to set the range of values for randomization. The wider the range, the more options will be available, and the smaller the range, the fewer. You can set the range by changing the min and max values. The final group of controls I want to talk about are found in the preset options section. Reset all parameters will wipe all buffers, rate changes, filter changes, and clear all presets. Force clear all buffers will wipe all 4 of the buffers. Overwrite default preset will make the current preset the default, and load last session preset will load the preset from your last session. Autosave to default preset will automatically save your presets from the current session as the default for future sessions. There's a lot to go into when it comes to presets, so I highly recommend checking out the documentation for this script. I'll have a link in the video description. Like I said in the intro, Noodle's software is intimately linked with the grid. A lot of the fun comes from playing the buffers like they're instruments, and the controls available on the grid make this very simple. Just like in previous episodes, I'm going to call the rows 1 through 8 and the columns A through P. The grid can be broken up into 6 sections. I'm going to start covering section 1, which covers columns A through F in rows 1 through 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4A allow you to switch the focus between the 4 tracks. You'll see this reflected on the Norns screen as you move between them. 1C will bring up the mix page on Norns. 1D will swap to the tape page. 1E will go to the filter page. That's all for this section. The next section can be found in columns A through F in rows 5 through 8. These are the recording and buffer selector controls. These follow the same layout for each of the 4 tracks, so I'll just be explaining track 1, which is found in row 5. 5A is the record toggle button. The buffer will keep recording until you hit 5B, which is the play button. This ends recording and starts looping. Once you have something recorded, you can start or stop playback of that loop by pressing the play button. If you want to overdub on the same loop, set the old amount on the mix page to a high value and press the record button again. 5C, D, E, and F represent the 4 available buffers. By default, track 1 is assigned to buffer 1, track 2 to buffer 2, and so on. You can change this at any time by selecting the desired buffer. You can also load audio files saved on Norns to any of the buffers. All you have to do is hold the key of the desired buffer until the load menu pops up, and then select the audio file you want to load. Next up, we have the rate and loop controls. These are found in rows 1 through 4 in columns G through O, and correspond to the 4 tracks. Like the record section, I'll only be covering row 1, which corresponds to track 1, since they're all the same. 1G sets the playback direction. By default, the loop is playing forwards, but if you press this button, it will start playing in reverse. 1H through 1N control the playback rate. These are the rate controls I was talking about during the tape page section of the video, and they are quantized to octave changes. By default, 1L will be illuminated, which is normal speed, and as you move to the right, the speed will increase, and as you go to the left, it will decrease. One thing worth mentioning here is that if you hold the key of the current speed and then press the rate you like to change to, the buffer will glide to that new rate instead of being instantaneous. The amount of time it takes to glide to the new rate is related to how long you were holding down the original key before selecting the new rate. This works for playback direction as well. If you hold down the reverse button before letting go, the speed will drop to 0 before starting up again in the opposite direction. The final button in this section is 1O, which is the loop toggle button. This is a really interesting feature, and when toggled off, it allows you to play the buffers like you would a sampler. Instead of the contents of the buffer looping, each time you select a preset, the audio within the window of the preset will be played like a one-shot. You can get really creative here by setting the different parameters to preset scope. To show a quick example, I've set the rate controls to preset and recorded a few notes into the buffer. I've also played around with the windows to get a variety of material between the presets. I have loop toggled off, and now when I press the different preset buttons, they will play through once and stop. This is really cool, but it gets even cooler once we get to the pattern section. Up next, we have the preset section, which you probably noticed in the example I just demonstrated. Like most of the controls on the grid, these are identical between tracks, so I'll just be covering 5G through 5M, which handle track 1. Pressing a button in this row will instantly recall the settings you have saved to that particular slot, provided the desired parameter is set to the preset scope. It's very easy to dial in speed changes this way. All you have to do is press a preset, press a rate, and repeat until you have some variety. There's one more section to cover before we get to my favorite part of the grid. Rows 5 through 8 in columns N and O represent the send and return toggles for the 4 tracks. N is the send toggle and O is the return toggle. This section allows you to send audio from one track to a virtual audio bus, which then returns it to the input of another track. Any track with a lit send key will output audio to any track with a lit return key. This is especially helpful for using noodles as a delay. Now we can talk about my favorite part of the script, which is the final section found in column P in rows 1 through 8. These are the pattern recorder slots. If you've watched my videos on MLR, MLRE, or cheat codes, then this concept should be relatively familiar. These slots allow you to record button presses on the grid in real time. To arm recording, press one of the empty slots. To stop recording, press it again. To stop playback, press the slot again. If you'd like to overdub more button presses, you can double tap. If you want to clear the pattern, long press. The possibilities here are truly endless. One really cool technique I've found is using the recorders to sequence a pattern with the preset slots, and then adding a second pattern that's toggling on and off looping. This creates a pretty crazy glitch effect. This is just scratching the surface, and you can really go nuts with dialing window locations, pan positions, and filter frequencies. I was originally planning on releasing this video the week after my Ripples video, but I felt like I wasn't fully grasping what this script was capable of. All in all, it took me somewhere in the range of 5 hours before it really clicked for me. I was able to understand that it was a 4-track looper with variable playback speed and the ability to work as a delay, but I was totally missing out on the utility of the preset slots. If there's one thing I can suggest to you, it's to play around with the preset slots, well that and to read the documentation, because Andrew has once again provided an extremely thorough and clear manual. Andrew also has a beautiful performance video, which I'll link in the description as well. That's all I've got for today. As always, thank you for watching, and if you have any topics or scripts you'd like to see me cover in a future episode, leave a comment below. I'll see you next time.